The Masquerade Ball Murder. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Invitation. Rose Simpson stared at the ornate invitation in her hand, brow furrowed in confusion. The thick cream-colored paper was embossed with gold lettering, inviting her to a masquerade ball at Thornfield Manor that very evening. But she had no recollection of being invited to such an event, nor any connection to the manor's owners. "How odd," she murmured, turning the invitation over. There was no return address or additional information, just the date, time, and location of the ball, along with instructions to wear a mask. Rose glanced at the clock. The ball was set to begin in just a few hours. She hesitated, unsure whether to attend an event she knew nothing about. But curiosity got the better of her. After all, it wasn't every day one received a mysterious invitation to a masquerade ball at a grand estate. With a small shrug, Rose decided to go. What was the harm? At worst, it would be an awkward evening. At best, perhaps a thrilling adventure. She hurried to her closet to find a suitable gown and mask for the occasion. Chapter 2. Arrival at Thornfield Manor. As Rose's cab pulled up the long, winding driveway to Thornfield Manor, she gasped at the sight before her. The enormous stone mansion loomed ahead, its many windows glowing with warm light. Ornate topiaries and marble statues dotted the expansive grounds. Guests in elaborate costumes and masks were already arriving, their laughter drifting on the evening breeze. Rose smoothed her emerald green gown and adjusted her feathered mask before stepping out of the cab. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and made her way up the grand staircase to the entrance. A butler in formal attire greeted her at the door. "Good evening, madam. May I see your invitation?" Rose handed over the cream-colored card. The butler examined it closely before nodding. "Very good. Welcome to Thornfield Manor. Please enjoy the ball." As she entered the grand foyer, Rose's eyes widened. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the marble floors and ornate furnishings. Guests in a dazzling array of costumes mingled, their faces obscured by intricate masks. Strains of classical music drifted from the ballroom. Rose accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and sipped it nervously. She didn't recognize a single person, even with the masks. Perhaps coming had been a mistake after all. Just as she was considering leaving, a man in an elaborate harlequin costume approached her. "I don't believe we've met," he said, bowing slightly. "I'm Charles. And you are?" "Rose," she replied with a small curtsy. "I must admit, I'm not quite sure why I was invited tonight. Do you know our hosts well?" Charles tilted his head. "To be honest, I received a rather unexpected invitation myself. I assumed it was from an old acquaintance, but now I'm not so certain. Curious, isn't it?" Rose nodded, relieved she wasn't the only one feeling out of place. "Very curious indeed. I wonder how many others are in a similar situation. Shall we investigate?" Charles offered his arm with a grin. "Perhaps between the two of us, we can unravel this little mystery." With a laugh, Rose took his arm. "Lead on, good sir. Let the sleuthing begin." Chapter 3. Mingling and Mysteries. As Rose and Charles made their way through the crowded ballroom, they struck up conversations with other guests. To their surprise, many seemed just as confused about their invitations as Rose and Charles were. "I assumed it was from my cousin Georgiana," said a woman in a peacock mask. "But I haven't seen her all evening." "How strange," mused a man dressed as a Roman centurion. "I thought perhaps it was from an old university friend, but I don't recognize anyone here." The more people they spoke to, the more perplexed Rose became. It seemed a significant portion of the guests had no idea why they'd been invited or who their hosts were. Yet the ball continued in full swing, with waiters circulating trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flowing freely. "Curiouser and curiouser," Rose murmured to Charles. "What do you make of all this?" He shook his head. "I'm not sure, but I intend to find out. Care to join me in some further investigation?" Rose grinned. "Absolutely. Where shall we start?" Charles glanced around the room. Perhaps we should try to locate our mysterious hosts. Surely someone must know who they are. They began to circulate again, this time asking specifically about the owners of Thornfield Manor. But their queries were met with shrugs and blank looks. I assumed it was the Blackwoods, said one guest. But come to think of it, I haven't seen them all evening. Thornfield Manor? Another guest looked confused. I thought this was Ravenswood Hall. At least, that's what my invitation said. Rose and Charles exchanged worried glances. Something very odd was going on indeed. Chapter 4. A startling discovery. As the evening wore on, Rose began to feel increasingly uneasy. The champagne and music flowed. Guests laughed and danced, but there was no sign of any hosts. And the more she and Charles investigated, the more inconsistencies they uncovered. I think we should explore the house, Charles whispered. See if we can find any clues about what's really going on here. Rose nodded in agreement. They slipped away from the ballroom and began to wander the dimly lit corridors of the manor. Most of the doors they tried were locked, but eventually they found an unlocked study. Charles glanced around before ushering Rose inside and closing the door behind them. Let's see what we can find. They began to search the room, rifling through drawers and examining bookshelves. Rose was leafing through some papers on the desk when she let out a small gasp. Charles, look at this. He hurried over to see what she'd found. It was a guest list for the ball, but it contained far more names than the number of people actually in attendance. And next to each name was a series of notations, bank account numbers, passwords, and other sensitive information. My God, Charles breathed. This isn't a party at all. It's some kind of elaborate scam. Just then they heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Rose and Charles froze, eyes wide with panic. The doorknob began to turn. Chapter 5. Unmasked. Rose and Charles held their breath as the door swung open. A woman in an elaborate butterfly mask entered, then stopped short when she saw them. Thinking quickly, Rose giggled and swayed slightly. Oh, I'm so sorry. We were looking for somewhere a bit more private. She gave Charles an exaggerated wink. The woman's posture relaxed slightly. This area is off limits to guests. Please return to the ballroom at once. Of course, Charles said smoothly, taking Rose's arm. Our apologies. What should we do now? Charles's expression was grim. We need to alert the authorities. This whole event is clearly some kind of criminal enterprise. Just then, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the manor. Rose and Charles exchanged alarmed glances before rushing toward the sound. They found a crowd gathering outside the conservatory. Pushing their way through, they gasped at the sight before them. A woman in an elaborate peacock gown lay crumpled on the floor, her mask askew. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. She's dead. Someone cried. Murdered. Chaos erupted as panicked guests began to flee. Rose grabbed Charles's arm. We can't let everyone leave. The killer will escape. He nodded grimly. You're right. We need to seal the exits and call the police. But as they turned to act, they found their path blocked by several large men in dark suits. The woman in the butterfly mask from earlier stepped forward, her eyes cold behind her glittering mask. I'm afraid no one will be going anywhere, she said smoothly. The game has only just begun. Chapter 6. A deadly game. The woman in the butterfly mask surveyed the terrified crowd with a cruel smile. Welcome, esteemed guests, to the real party. I'm sure you're all wondering what's going on. Allow me to enlighten you. She began to pace slowly, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Each of you was carefully selected for this event. Your wealth, your connections, your secrets, all make you valuable players in our little game. A murmur of confusion and fear rippled through the crowd. Rose felt Charles tense beside her. The rules are simple, the woman continued. In this room is a killer. One of you, in fact. Your job is to unmask the murderer before they strike again. If you succeed, you all go free. If you fail, she trailed off ominously. Well, let's just say the consequences will be most unpleasant. This is madness. A man in the crowd shouted. You can't hold us here against our will. The woman's eyes flashed dangerously. I assure you we can and we will. The manor is surrounded by armed guards. Any attempt to escape will be met with lethal force. Rose's mind raced. This was far worse than she'd imagined. Not only were they being held hostage, but they were expected to solve a murder with a room full of strangers, one of whom was the killer. You have until dawn, the woman announced. I suggest you start investigating. Time is ticking away, and our killer may strike again at any moment. With that, she swept from the room, leaving the stunned guests to absorb the horrifying situation they found themselves in. Charles turned to Rose, his face pale beneath his mask. What do we do now? Rose took a deep breath, steeling herself. We do exactly what she said. We investigate. It's our only chance of getting out of here alive. Chapter 7: Clues and Suspects. As the initial shock wore off, the guests began to organize themselves. Rose and Charles quickly emerged as natural leaders, given their earlier sleuthing. All right, everyone. Rose addressed the group. We need to work together if we're going to solve this. First, does anyone recognize the victim? After a moment of silence, a woman in a swan costume stepped forward. I think it's Amelia Blackwood, the owner of the manor. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. Charles frowned. But if she's the owner, why did so many of us receive mysterious invitations? And why was she mingling with the guests instead of hosting? Maybe she didn't know about the party, someone suggested. Maybe this whole thing was set up without her knowledge. Rose nodded thoughtfully. It's possible. But that still doesn't explain who killed her or why. They began to systematically interview each guest, taking note of alibis and any potential motives. As the night wore on, several suspects emerged. James Holloway, a business rival of Amelia's, who stood to gain financially from her death. Vivian Reed, Amelia's former best friend, who had a falling out with her over a man they both loved. Thomas Green, Amelia's lawyer, who seemed suspiciously knowledgeable about her affairs. Eleanor Blackwood, Amelia's estranged sister, who had arrived unexpectedly at the party. It's not much to go on, Charles sighed as he and Rose compared notes. And we're running out of time. Rose glanced at the ornate clock on the mantel. It was nearly 3 a.m. They had just a few hours left before dawn. We need to search the house again, she said decisively. There must be more clues we've missed. As they turned to leave the room, a blood-curdling scream rang out once more. Rose's heart sank. The killer had struck again. Chapter 8. Another victim. The guests rushed toward the sound of the scream, which seemed to be coming from the library. Rose and Charles pushed their way to the front of the crowd, dreading what they might find. The scene that greeted them was grisly. Thomas Green, the lawyer, lay sprawled across an antique desk, a letter opener protruding from his back. A half-empty glass of brandy had spilled across important-looking documents. Oh God, Rose whispered, feeling ill. We're too late. Charles put a steadying hand on her arm. We can't give up now. This might actually help us narrow down our suspects. He was right, of course. Several of the guests they'd been eyeing as potential killers now had alibis, having been in plain sight when the second murder occurred. But that still left them with multiple suspects and precious little time. As Rose examined the scene, something caught her eye. In shaky handwriting it read, "The truth is in the will. Beware the butterfly." Rose showed it to Charles, her mind racing. The one who seems to be in charge. It's possible. And the will. That must mean Amelia's will. So Thomas discovered something in the will, Rose mused. Something that got him killed. But what? Charles wondered. And how does it connect to everything else that's happening? Rose squared her shoulders. We need to find that will. Chapter 9: Revelations. With time running short, Rose and Charles split up to search the manor more efficiently. Rose took the upper floors while Charles explored the ground level and basement. As Rose rifled through drawers and cabinets, her mind whirled with possibilities. What secret could be hidden in Amelia's will that was worth killing for? And how did it connect to the strange circumstances of the party? Inside was a sealed envelope marked Last Will and Testament of Amelia Blackwood. Heart-pounding, Rose broke the seal and began to read. Meanwhile, Charles had made a discovery of his own in the wine cellar. Behind a false wall, he found a high-tech computer setup with multiple screens displaying security camera feeds from around the manor. But it was a stack of folders on the desk that truly caught his attention. Each was labeled with the name of a guest at the party, containing detailed personal and financial information. As Charles flipped through the files, the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just a murder mystery. It was an elaborate con targeting wealthy and influential individuals. He rushed back upstairs to find Rose, nearly colliding with her as she ran down the hall. "Charles!" she exclaimed. "I found the will." "You won't believe Dash. It's a scam," he interrupted. "The whole party is a setup to gather sensitive information on the guests." Rose nodded grimly. "I know. The will explains everything. Amelia wasn't just the owner of the manor. She was the mastermind behind the entire operation. But then who killed her?" Charles wondered. "And why?" Before Rose could respond, the clock began to chime. It was dawn. Chapter 10. The Final Unmasking. As the last chime faded away, the woman in the butterfly mask appeared at the top of the grand staircase. The remaining guests gathered in the foyer, tension thick in the air. "Time's up," she announced coldly. "I do hope you've solved our little puzzle. Your lives depend on it, after all." Rose stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "We have." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Do tell." "This entire event was a scam," Rose began, "orchestrated by Amelia Blackwood to gather sensitive information on wealthy and influential individuals. But something went wrong." Charles picked up the thread. Amelia was killed by one of her own conspirators, someone who wanted to take over the operation for themselves. The woman in the butterfly mask stiffened almost imperceptibly. "And who might that be?" Rose met her gaze steadily. "You, Eleanor Blackwood, Amelia's sister and second in command." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The woman in the butterfly mask slowly removed her disguise, revealing a face strikingly similar to the deceased Amelia's. "Very good," Eleanor said, her voice laced with venom. "But knowing the truth won't save you." "Oh, I think it will," Charles interjected. "You see, while you were busy playing your deadly game, we took the liberty of contacting the authorities." As if on cue, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Eleanor's face contorted with rage. "You fools!" she snarled. "You have no idea what you've done." Rose stood her ground. "We've stopped you from ruining more lives. Amelia's will revealed everything. How you two had been running this con for years, targeting the wealthy and powerful. But Amelia wanted out. She was going to confess, turn herself in. You couldn't allow that, could you?" Eleanor's composure cracked. She was weak. All that power, all that potential, and she wanted to throw it away. "I couldn't let that happen. This operation is mine now." "Not for long," Charles said grimly as the sound of breaking glass and shouts filled the air. Police officers began to storm the manor. In a desperate move, Eleanor pulled a gun from beneath her gown. "Nobody move. I'll shoot." But before she could act, one of the guests, the man dressed as a Roman centurion, tackled her to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor. "Well done, Detective Harris," Rose said with a smile. The man grinned as he handcuffed Eleanor. "Couldn't have done it without you two. When you contacted the station with your suspicions, we knew we had to act fast." As Eleanor was led away, the guests began to cheer. The nightmare was finally over. Chapter 11. Aftermath. In the days that followed, the full extent of the Blackwood sisters' operation came to light. Dozens of wealthy individuals had been targeted over the years, their personal and financial information used for blackmail and fraud. Rose and Charles were hailed as heroes for their quick thinking and bravery. As they gave their statements to the police, they couldn't help but marvel at the unlikely friendship that had formed between them. "I have to say," Charles remarked, "for a mysterious masquerade ball that turned into a hostage situation and murder investigation, this evening turned out rather well." Rose laughed. "Only you could see it that way. But I suppose you're right. At the very least, it's been unforgettable." As they prepared to go their separate ways, Charles hesitated. "Listen, Rose. I was wondering if perhaps you'd like to get dinner sometime? Under less dramatic circumstances, of course." Rose smiled warmly. "I'd like that very much." As they exchanged numbers, both felt a sense of excitement for what the future might hold. Sometimes it seemed the most unexpected nights could lead to the most wonderful beginnings. Chapter 12. Buried Secrets. 6 months after the events at Thornfield Manor, Rose and Charles found themselves drawn back into the world of mystery and intrigue. A letter arrived at their home, postmarked from a small village in the countryside. The contents were shocking. "Dear Miss Simpson and Mr. Holloway, I write to you in desperation. The truth about Amelia Blackwood's murder was never fully revealed. There are deeper, darker secrets yet to be uncovered. Please, I implore you to come to Millbrook Village. All will be explained. Yours sincerely, Margaret Winters." Rose and Charles exchanged worried glances. "What do you think?" Charles asked. Rose bit her lip. "I think we owe it to ourselves to find out. We never did understand why Amelia was targeted specifically." And so, they found themselves driving down winding country roads to the picturesque Millbrook Village. Margaret Winters, they discovered, was the housekeeper who had worked at Thornfield Manor for over 3 decades. The elderly woman greeted them with trembling hands. "Thank you for coming," she said, ushering them into her cottage. "I couldn't live with the guilt any longer." Over tea, Margaret revealed a tale that shook Rose and Charles to their core. "Amelia and Eleanor weren't always criminals," Margaret began. "They were once kind, generous women. But 20 years ago, something changed." She went on to explain that the Blackwood sisters had fallen in love with the same man, a charming aristocrat named Victor Hartley. Victor had toyed with both their affections, playing them against each other. In the end, he chose Amelia. "Eleanor was devastated," Margaret continued, "but she hid her pain well. Too well, perhaps. She suggested they all go on a boating trip to celebrate the engagement. But out on the lake—" Margaret's voice broke. "There was an accident. Victor drowned." Rose gasped. "You mean?" Margaret nodded grimly. "Eleanor orchestrated the whole thing. She murdered Victor out of jealousy and revenge. Amelia was heartbroken, but she helped cover it up to protect her sister." "But that was 20 years ago," Charles interjected. "Why kill Amelia now?" "Because Amelia couldn't live with the guilt anymore," Margaret explained. "She wanted to confess, not just to their financial crimes, but to Victor's murder as well. Eleanor couldn't allow that." Rose sat back stunned. So the entire criminal enterprise, all those years of cons and scams, were Eleanor's way of punishing the wealthy elite she blamed for creating men like Victor, Margaret finished. And Amelia went along with it out of guilt and loyalty to her sister. Until she couldn't anymore. As Rose and Charles left the cottage, their minds reeled with this new information. The Masquerade Ball murder hadn't just been about money or power. It had been the tragic culmination of decades of guilt, resentment, and misplaced loyalty. "I suppose some masks," Rose mused sadly, "are worn long before any ball begins." Charles nodded, taking her hand. "And some secrets are buried so deep, they poison everything they touch." As they drove away from Millbrook Village, both Rose and Charles felt a renewed appreciation for the honesty and trust they shared. They had seen firsthand how personal grudges and long-buried conflicts could lead to tragedy. It only strengthened their resolve to face life's challenges together, with open hearts and unmasked faces. Chapter 13. Justice Revisited. Armed with this new information, Rose and Charles faced a moral dilemma. The case had been closed, Eleanor was in prison, and reopening old wounds could cause more pain for everyone involved. However, the truth about Victor's death remained hidden, and justice had not been fully served. After much deliberation, they decided to approach Detective Harris with Margaret's story. The detective listened gravely, his expression darkening as he absorbed the implications. "This changes everything," he said finally. "We'll need to reopen the investigation, possibly exhume Victor's body. It won't be easy after all this time, but we owe it to him and all the victims to uncover the whole truth." In the weeks that followed, Rose and Charles watched as the media frenzy reignited around the Blackwood case. Eleanor, confronted with the new evidence, finally broke down and confessed to both murders, Victor's and Amelia's. The revelation sent shockwaves through high society. Many who had attended the fateful Masquerade ball were forced to confront their own roles in the sisters' descent into criminality. The ripple effects of Victor's long-ago murder had touched more lives than anyone could have imagined. As the dust settled, Rose and Charles found themselves reflecting on the nature of truth, justice, and the long-lasting impact of our choices. "It's strange," Rose mused one evening as they sat in their garden. "In a way, everyone at that ball was wearing a mask long before they put on their costumes. Eleanor hiding her guilt, Amelia hiding her knowledge of Victor's death, even the guests hiding their own secrets and insecurities." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "And in the end, it was the removal of those masks, the revelation of truth, that allowed for real justice and healing." As the sun set on another day, Rose and Charles held each other close, grateful for the honesty and trust they shared. They had seen the devastating consequences of buried grudges and hidden truths. It only strengthened their commitment to face life with open hearts and clear consciences, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The Masquerade Ball murder had been solved, but its lessons would remain with them always, a reminder of the power of truth and the importance of confronting the past to build a better future. The end.
Subscribe for more.